Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is David Swain from the National Disability Coordination Officer Program, and I'd like to welcome you along to the last session of the Accessible Procurement series, session 5, which is all about Plan B. Before we officially start though, I'd just like to cover off on some housekeeping. So our conversation today is being captioned by Bradley Reporting. One of the team will place a link to the OneCap page if you prefer to run captions in your browser into the chat, or you can activate the captions using the CC button. This session is being recorded and will be made available on the Coordit website with a little bit more of a time delay because some of the team are traveling at the moment. You're not muted by default, so you can unmute and talk. You are more than welcome to use the chat function if you want to participate in discussion. If you would like to speak, you can use the raise hand function and we'll facilitate you in. Or if you need to, you can just unmute yourself and speak. Whatever works for you is fine. Before we formally begin, I'd just like to say that the NDCO program, ADSET and Coordit acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. So where I am in Townsville, I recognise the Bindal and the Woolgarugabar peoples and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. So workshop 5 of 5 of the series that focuses on the implementation of accessible ICT procurement policy and practice in your institutions. This session is all about what happens when things aren't accessible. What do we do? What's the plan B? So we'll talk through how to put in place alternative plans and solutions when vendors can't give you or won't give you an accessible product yet. Today's session is again being run by Andrew Arch and Neil Jarvis from Intopia, who many of you will now be familiar with from the previous sessions. Whenever I'm facilitating, I'd like to make a mention that we're really thankful and would like to acknowledge Coordit for their commitment to this. And it is important work, and we hope that the guide and the supporting workshops will be a valuable resource for the higher ed sector onwards. If this is your first session for any reason, the Accessible ICT Procurement Guide that all of these workshops have been built upon is available on the Coordit website alongside previous session recordings. Okay, well, let's get into the session. I'd like to hand over to Andrew and Neil now to take us away for the final part of the series. Thank you both.
Thanks, David.
Okay, thanks very much, David, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here one more time, and we thought we would start just with a very, very brief recap to remind people how we got to where we are now. This is the 5th and the final of the webinars that we have done throughout August. The first one was an introduction to accessible ICT procurement, and in that webinar we provided an overview of the end-to-end process of accessible ICT procurement. So we really did a kind of a general holistic view of everything that we wanted to cover in the course of this series of webinars, and also in the toolkit that David has referenced already. The second webinar was called Ensuring You Are Ready, and that introduced the pieces which must be in place before a meaningful accessible ICT procurement strategy can be formulated. You can't just start and go. You've actually got to get all your ducks in a row so that you're maximizing your chances of success. We covered policy, governance, choosing appropriately skilled and informed personnel to undertake the roles in the process of accessible ICT procurement. The third webinar was called Asking the Right Questions, and that was the one where we really got into presenting the questions that you should be asking vendors at all stages of the procurement process. You know, whether that was just at the RFI stage or the RFP stage, or at the point of agreeing a contract, and also when you're in maintenance mode, when you're actually following up on the contract later down the track. We talked about setting vendor expectations so that they knew that accessibility was something that was important to you, and how you should go about doing that. We then moved on to the fourth, which was interpreting the responses to those questions. So all very well asking really good questions, but if you're not getting good answers, it's not very helpful. So we talked about the ways that people typically answer questions around accessibility, and we wanted to provide an understanding of how vendors think and how they try to answer the questions that you've been asking. And we specifically talked about thinking about what they are really saying when they say what they say. So read the language carefully, read the wording carefully, and we paid close attention to how people write an accessibility conformance report, because that tells you a lot about all the accessibility features that they may or may not have built into their product. So that brings us up to where we are today, and brings us up to the point where we are looking at what happens when you've done all that you can do, you've asked all the right questions, and then you discover that despite all of that, there may not be a completely accessible or indeed partly accessible solution. What do you do? Well, you can't give up. You've actually got to have a next stage, which is the a fallback plan.
So why do we need that fallback plan? You know, what Neil said is that we are probably not going to be able to buy the perfectly accessible product. You know, it's always going to have problems for one person or one group. You know, that might be a very small group, but you still need to think about what your plan B is when it doesn't work for that group. So, you know, as Neil said, we've just, you know, spent the last few weeks talking about how to get to this point. But now you've signed a contract and, you know you've got problems. What are you going to do about it? You know, how can we put an alternative plan in place? And we have to have one because, you know, we're realistic, you know, and in the real world, we know that while accessibility is essential, we also know that sometimes or often or most times probably there simply isn't a fully accessible solution out there that's going to meet the needs of everyone. You know, we'd like an ideal world, a utopia, if you like, but that world doesn't exist at this point. So we're going to have to make those compromises and say, this product that we're about to buy or about to you know, get built, you know, meets all the functional needs that we want to do the particular job, but it doesn't meet all our accessibility needs. And you're probably going to rank functionality over accessibility. You're probably going to rank security and maybe privacy over accessibility. So these are the compromises that you have to, you know, you're going to have to make, and you're going to have to accept this isn't perfectly accessible. So that's when we say, you know, can we put an alternative plan in place for access until we can correct some of the accessibilities, or the vendor can correct some of the accessibility failures that you've encountered or that have been disclosed to you? So you know, hopefully your vendor is going to be working on a roadmap. So, you know, that's something else. Also, you know, you might have bought a piece of ICT, a product or a service or a piece of software without thinking about accessibility. You've now discovered that you've got some problems. You know, not much you can do about it at this point, but to put an alternative plan in place until you know, go through the next round of procurement, or look at, you know, renewing a contract for a particular piece of software or a service. You might need it, you know, because that product is only partially accessible, not fully accessible. So if your vendor cannot provide you with that fully accessible solution, and in reality, that's probably unlikely, you need to think about a way to fill the gap so that the few people or the many people that are going to have difficulty can still get the service, undertake that particular bit of work that they might have been engaged to do, something that they're studying to do, might be a lab management software, piece of software, whatever. There's probably going to be, it might not be important today, but you don't know, what staff you might be employing next month, next year, what students might enroll in that course, in the future. So being aware of the problems and then having that plan B waiting or to be put in place when you need is much better than being reactive when somebody comes up and says, can't use it. So very quickly, like we've done the last few times, a poll. Do you have an plan for an alternative plan for ICT accessibility? Have you thought what to do if you can't procure that fully accessible utopian ICT product? And as tertiary education staff, question to you, but then, what does your institution do? Do they have a fallback solution? What might they have in place that, you might be aware of? We're getting quite a few answers coming in now. There's still quite a few people who can respond. Give you a minute or two to think about this, because think about the breadth of ICT that you use every day, that your colleagues might use every day, that the students you're working with might use every day, or even the ICT products and services that you might only be using occasionally. Looks like we're getting pretty stable now. Last call, I think there's still a few people who haven't responded yet. If you want to, we don't know who you are. This is fully anonymous, so you can be quite honest here. Okay, so what have we got? We've got, in terms of question 1, have you thought about what to do if you can't procure a fully accessible solution? We've got 43% of people saying yes, which is excellent. Really pleased to hear that, see that. 57% have said no. On the question of does your institution have a formal plan to work with in case ICT solutions are not accessible, we've said 7% have said yes, 29% have said no, and 64% have said don't know. So, that's probably a reasonable split across there. I must admit that we didn't expect you to know what the organisation as a whole might be up to unless you actually work in the ICT department or work in the diversity and inclusion and support space. So pretty much what we thought. Okay, just a moment and we will close that and move on. Darren's just thrown a comment into chat. Answer to poll is with a comment. I said yes, but the solution is to send any issues to the equity staff. So not really a great solution. Exactly, Darren, because they're going to have to come up with how we're going to help this person with something that they can't, to still do the job or undertake the study with something that they can't work with. But yes.
And indeed, this is why a plan B or is going to be really important, because the very fact that it's a plan means that you're thinking about what to do in the event that you can't get the accessible solution that you want to get, and that when that happens, you're not suddenly panicking and trying to find anyone who can just pick up the problem. There needs to be a thought through approach to what to do in this eventuality. So to stress, this is a plan B we're talking about. It should only be used in a very limited number of specific circumstances which prevent you from procuring accessible ICT. I mean, I'll be honest, I always feel a bit dirty when I'm talking about plan Bs and or alternative plans of this sort, because you're offering people, at first glance, it appears that you're offering people a way, almost a way out of dealing with of requiring accessible ICT, but you're not, because what you're actually doing is covering the eventuality that accessible ICT isn't available. You can't just cross your fingers and hope. You have to have a solution for when things don't quite go the way that you want them to. So there are circumstances where you just have to say a plan B scenario is really a good idea. And these might include, well, there simply was not a solution which was accessible and which satisfied your other procurement requirements. If that was the case, then obviously you're going to be faced with that situation. Second reason might be that there is potentially an accessible solution, which won't, though, be accessible in time for when you want to deploy the software or the hardware or whatever the equipment is, but that the vendor does have a clear roadmap for remedying this this problem. So there is going to be a solution. It's coming down the track. You can point to that, and you know that in every other respect, the solution is what you want. Of course, you're going to probably likely go with a solution that that gives you all your other requirements and is promising to give you accessibility in a reasonable amount of time. But in
This
that,
is probably something you've negotiated before you signed the contract.
yeah,
And as we said, accessibility should be an ongoing relationship with many of your vendors for exactly this reason.
yeah. And in that eventuality, you are going to be able to say by this date, we're going to be able to deploy and implement an accessible solution. So that's a reasonable option, but you're still going to have a plan in place for the duration, for the gap time. The third reason is that the solution you've decided to purchase, it's partially accessible, but it will still prove difficult or indeed impossible for some people to use. And that's because whilst many solutions will offer a solution to some people with some disabilities, they may not offer solutions to everybody. And in that situation, you're still going to be making a calculated guess and taking a bit of a risk, really, as to what level of accessibility you're prepared to accept and not. So that's a possible third reason. And then the fourth one would be the cost of making the product accessible would be unreasonably prohibitive in the course of bringing in the product to your institution. And in that eventuality, it's just not going to happen. So you have to think about, well, what are we going to do in the meantime? Then there is the issue of, it might be a case of, by working on improving the accessibility of the product, you might adversely affect the overall functionality of the product for other reasons. Now, I don't think that's a very likely one, but it has happened in some instances. So again, it would be a factor you'd want to consider if you were going to think about whether you need to have a fallback plan, which is what we're talking about today. So what you would need would be a process to tide you over until you'd got to the point where an accessible solution was available. But it does go without saying that no accessibility is no solution. So really important for us to realize and understand that it is making the best of situation. It's a plan B. it's okay as long as there's a way out of it.
So Neil just mentioned risk, and we have to accept that having inaccessible ICT is a risk. Is it a risk that you're prepared to take, and how are you going to minimise that risk? So before we dive into the detail of an alternate access plan, it's worth reminding yourself that every time you make a purchase that is not accessible, there is going to be a risk involved, from just a minor complaint through to maybe getting a court case, maybe some reputational risks. Students are going to say your institution doesn't make stuff accessible for this particular course, which might reduce the number of students you get, all sorts of implications there. So we would strongly recommend that, inaccessibility, even if it's only small, when you've made that assessment before you signed the contract, after you had all those questions answered, weighed them all up, even if it's only a small risk of some people not being able to access the product or service, then it should be recorded on your organisation's risk register. And the level of risk can then obviously be recorded with it. So, as I said, the risk is legal, reputational, and both of those can lead to commercial risk. So we did discuss risk in the second webinar of the series, but to recap, the level of risk is clearly not going to be the same as I've just said for all ICT. And I think I used the example earlier in this series of webinars. The software used by 7 or 10 people in a lab to manage a particular analytical process obviously is going to carry less risk than a system that's going to be used by all your students, an enrollment system, the learning management system, something like that. So, that level of risk is going to, in those two situations, is going to be widely different. So you should have that risk management strategy in place, and it should be properly applied throughout the procurement process. And we did mention that there is an Australian standard, ISO 31000, that was adopted in 2018 here in Australia, called Risk Management Guidelines. It's an Australian standard that can help you manage those risks and make decisions around those risks. So, presumably the people managing risk in your institution will be aware of that, but you need them to feed into this to say, okay, how much of a risk is there in terms of how much effort sometimes you might even put into preparing that plan B.
And risk is an iterative process. We talked about that as well, and it's we're just going to revisit that very, very briefly here, because it is important to remember that risk is iterative. And that means that the level of risk and the impact of that risk and the consequences of that risk are going to change over time and for different situations. So when thinking about risk and how you should treat it, worth remembering that there are things to bear in mind when judging risk. You need to formulate treatment options, and those options might include things like avoiding the risk altogether, not continuing with the activity because it's too risky, or it might be taking the risk in order to follow through on an opportunity that you want to take up. Or it might be removing the risk source. Then it could be changing the likelihood of the risk or changing the consequences of the risk. And then it could be sharing the risk with somebody else, like, for example, the vendor. And then there's retaining the risk via an informed decision. So you're being realistic that anything that you do is going to carry some risk with it, but is it at a point that you can actually bear? Then you want to think about planning and implementation, and assessing effectiveness of that plan and the implementation of that. you want to decide whether remaining risk is acceptable. And you want to decide if there's any further action that you should be taking with respect to that risk in this particular instance. You'll be able to do that because hopefully you will have used a risk strategy to inform all of your procurement process, and this is just part of that strategy.
So, how can we formulate an equally effective alternate access plan, which we've just called a Plan B for shorthand? It's basically a procedure whereby you're recognising that you do have or will potentially have an accessibility problem. You know that the ICT you've purchased isn't 100% accessible, and you're recognising that, and you're looking for ways to mitigate the consequential risk and ensuring those people who require an accessible solution are not excluded by your institution through that purchase. So the equally effective alternate access plan, and I think from now on we're just going to call it the Plan B because that's too much of a mouthful. It is a document then that describes how the information or the service or the product will be made available to individuals until they that particular product can be made accessible. And as Neil said, we hope that that's part of the negotiations that you had during the contract, and that they do have a roadmap to address the accessibility issues that they told you about, hopefully, and you accepted that this is okay and we're going to fix it, or that you discovered during the inquiry process of shortlisting and then signing up a particular vendor. So the plan doesn't require every individual to have an identical experience, but it should be offering an experience that can provide a similar service, access to a body of knowledge or a learning opportunity as the rest of the population is going to get from using that piece of software or service. So some examples of accommodations that might be in that Plan B might include the ICC support desk might assist somebody to complete the installation of an app where a QR code is the only method provided by the software. So to actually install that, or it might be if it's not a QR code, it might be secondary confirmation that the student is who they say they are. It might be the allocation of some resources to employ some support staff, i.e. for the creation of documents or the transformation of documents into formats that are different from those initially provided, but will meet the needs of a particular group or particular students with disabilities. Sometimes you might be able to use some third-party alternatives to plug the gaps that are left. E.g. third-party captioning for video conferencing software as distinct from something built in like it is in things like Zoom and Teams. And that's one of the suggestions from Andrew Norman, who worked with several other people very closely on this kit with us.
So what are the benefits of an equally effective alternative action?
Just call the Plan B, Neil.
Plan, or a Plan B, as we say. Well, the benefits are considerable. They provide a well thought out solution rather than an ad hoc workaround. And this is why you do anything. In other words, you're not making it up as you go along. And more importantly, the poor user at the end of the chain isn't having to work it out themselves as to what needs to be done. How often have you yourselves been in a situation where you're using a service or a piece of technology, it doesn't work, so you get onto the helpline with the vendor, and the vendor says, "Oh no, that's not our problem. It's, I don't know, Microsoft's problem or Apple's problem," and Apple say, "Well, it's not our problem. It's a third-party problem." That happens to disabled people all the time if accessibility isn't in place for them, and it's always somebody else was supposed to have taken care of that, whether it was ICT, whether it was diversity and inclusion, whether it was somebody else. So having a thought out approach, a process that is followed when something isn't accessible and someone encounters inaccessibility is a real benefit of a plan like this. Then there is the one I really like, which it focuses on the barrier to access rather than on the individual user. That's a really, really powerful one because again, it's relieving the end user of the problem. It's reminding everyone that they are not the cause of this problem. The inaccessible equipment is the source of the problem. And since the institution has obtained that inaccessible equipment, it kind of has a moral responsibility to put the thing right. And so it systemizes the issue rather than individualizes it. And I think that's a really powerful benefit of a plan B. A third one would be that it reduces frustration by highlighting the barriers to access upfront. So if you know that there's going to be a problem, you can put a plan B in place to deal with that, but also the individual user can strategize as to how they're going to resolve that. If they know they're going to have an access issue, they can start thinking about what that will mean for them and how they're going to circumvent it themselves in a way that they can't do if they suddenly come across a problem in a mission critical moment, like, for example, trying to submit an assignment. It improves communication between the users and the support services. So people know if there's a process in place, they know where to go, who to ask, what to ask. It just smooths that process so that people, again, going back to the earlier point, they're not frustrated, but they do know where to go and how. And it just makes that whole user experience less frictionful, and I think that's a powerful benefit, and it can only happen if you've thought through how that's going to happen. And then it documents the deficits that we know about, so that they can be included in future planning for upgrading the equipment or replacing the equipment. If we know that these problems exist in the current iteration of the service or the software or the hardware, then documenting it, which you can do because the plan's in place, means that you're already on your way to formulating the questions that you're going to be asking next time you make a procurement move, and the next time that you set the criteria for what you want, you know that these things are going to need to be dealt with.
Now, what are some of the important considerations, in preparing a plan B? We know that we've got some known defects, but knowing that is not a way of getting out of your accessibility obligations. There's still going to be some people who are going to have difficulty, and that's why we're talking about having a plan B. In many cases, the provision of that alternative access will require just as much or more effort than implementing an accessible solution by default, simply because of the nature of the the software or the service or the piece of hardware that you're trying to buy. So do be aware of that. To provide somebody with an alternative means of doing something, of accessing something, of getting some information, of studying a particular course. While the mainstream solutions are not accessible, some of the alternatives that you might come up with, could be just as costly in some respects, or require as much effort as the one that the mainstream body of people is going to be used. So the methods that are outlined in the plan need to be well publicised, and Neil mentioned the importance of communication. The fact that you've got these in place, need to make sure that that what these alternatives are need to be publicised. And when I say on a regular basis, each term, each year, as new students might enrol in the course, or you've got a turnover of staff, lab support staff or whatever they might be, so that all of the people know, okay, if I've got a problem, there's something here that is going to help me out. Otherwise, there's a risk that that your users might not even know that there's a plan B, and it'll turn up on somebody's desk and say, what do we do about this? So, as support staff or as the student, you need to have access to this information so that, staff aren't put on the spot when a problem arises. Training on that Plan B should also be provided to anybody who might be expected to provide support so that they know what to do in those circumstances, what that alternative access might be, and how easy or what to use as an alternative bit of software or alternative product. That might be needed to be put in place. It's not something that's going to be just sitting there. They're going to have to go and seek it out and put it in place when a student, for instance, finds they can't access something. So making sure that the staff, the lecturers, the lab support staff, the tutors who are going to be confronted with this inaccessible situation, know what to do there and then. The plan should include a means by which people can feed back their views or make a complaint about the inaccessibility. You mightn't have found or mightn't be aware of all the issues that might arise for absolutely everybody. You might allow for, say, the mainstream screen reader users, but you may end up with an international student who uses something else that isn't in common use in Australia, and you hadn't expected to have a problem with the particular ICT solution that is in place. So, the ability to get that feedback, you might not have even been aware that there's a problem. The vendor and yourselves in negotiating the contract before you signed that contract, with all the questions you asked, mightn't have unearthed a issue that is going to be problematic for some people. So by having that feedback mechanism, allows you to further engage with those students or staff, and also with your vendor to say, okay, how are we going to address this longer term? And the other side of that feedback might be, some of the students or staff might help you improve your Plan B, in fact, because they're the people who are actually going to have to, put it in, work with it to, do the workaround for the bit that isn't working. So while you might have, what you think is an excellent Plan B in place for a particular group of people or a particular piece of assistive technology that isn't going to work, working with the people who actually have to then use that solution can help you improve that for the next group of people who might have difficulty.
So then we get down to the question of what an equally effective alternate access plan should contain. And Andrew is right, I'm going to fall back to Plan B. And this this is something which is, when it comes down to it, what are you going to put in the plan that that people will be able to follow easily? Well, there are lots of examples in the public domain of Plan B documents that you can look at, and we do provide links to a couple of those examples in the toolkit, so feel free to go and look at those. And we will talk through in a moment a couple of examples that we think exemplify good practice, what that plan should look like from a couple of higher education institutions that we identified. And what those examples will show you is that they do it in their own way, so it's very much their plan. It's not a template as such, although you could create a template quite happily. But they're basically doing the same thing, and they're covering some broad headings that would include product version and date. So you're obviously wanting to be really clear about what product you're making a plan for, what the version number and the date of revision was, because that product will change over time. The purpose of the plan, why you're even doing it, why you have to do it. It's reminding people that that the original ideal solution wasn't available. Then instructions for those who are completing the request for a product to be assigned to a plan B. In other words, they're effectively asking for an exemption to your accessibility policy. What is a process that they must go through to formally request that? And it should be a formal request, because if you have to do it formally, you have to take it seriously, and you have to be made to understand that this is not a light request that you're making. It should have contact details of the person or persons who will be responsible for making the request, as well as those responsible for operating the plan, if that's different, and it probably will be different. So if one team is saying we can't make this product accessible, but we still need to have it, so we're asking for a plan B solution, and we're going to ask this group of people over there to take responsibility for filling in the gaps. Well, that group of people needs to know that, and they need to be identified so that the people taking advantage of the plan know that as well. It needs to have details of the system in question as well, including its function, the number of users that are expected to be using it, because that might impact on the decision as to whether to allow the request. And there should be details of any other systems which this one will be connected to or be integrated with, and what impact that might have on those other systems. We all know that technology never exists in an independent state. There's always a connection to other pieces of software and other bits of hardware. What is going to be the implication for those bits of hardware with the inaccessibility of this particular product? And then we need to identify potential barriers to access. So what are those barriers? Why has it been determined that this product can't be made accessible? Is it, for example, an inability to be used via the keyboard? That is a very common one, and it's one that might well have been picked up during testing and reported through the ACR. Who is likely to be affected, and in what way? So e.g., are we talking about students? Are we talking about staff members? Are we talking both? Is it someone who's about to submit an assignment? I mentioned that example earlier, and I mentioned that example earlier because it was one that was given to us during the process of putting the toolkit together. It was a real life example of someone who had done all the work that they were supposed to do, were preparing to submit their assignment. When it got to the very last step of the process, they couldn't do it because of the inaccessibility of that particular portal. So who are the people that are going to be impacted by the inaccessibility of this equipment? Or it might be staff members who need to use a piece of equipment, let's say, to apply for leave. That is a very common function that staff members have to do. If they can't use the system that they're required to apply for leave, how are they going to be able to take their break over the long summer holidays? What are the accessibility issues there? And also, it might be that they're using a messaging system in-house that doesn't meet accessibility requirements. What are the implications for that, for them to be able to be in touch with their colleagues and do their job? And then what are the details of the alternative provision that's being proposed? And you need to include in that point a list of tasks and resources that will be needed to make that happen. Identification of any resources which will be needed to support the plan's inception. That might include training, because people might need to be brought up to speed in terms of their skill set in order to be able to provide an alternative way of supporting people. It might be a question of using alternative equipment to make do in the meantime. If that's the case, do people know how to use that equipment, and how accessible is that equipment? And how will the plan be communicated to stakeholders, whether that be students, staff, support staff, whoever it happens to be? As Andrew mentioned earlier on, it's obviously very, very important to have everyone knowing about the plan. Otherwise, it's just a document sitting on a shelf. But what is the communication processes that will be used to make that happen? And don't just assume that somebody will know what to do and know how to communicate that information. Have that written down in place as part of the plan. And the process which will be followed by the institution and the vendor to overcome the barriers at the end of the day. As we've said, this is a temporary solution. It's not meant to be a final way of dealing with the problem. This is still a case that the barriers of accessibility need to be overcome, and what is the thinking for how that's going to happen? Because if they're not mentioned, the chances are there is no thinking for how that's going to happen. At least anyone could be forgiven for thinking that. And what's the expected duration of the plan? There should be an expiry date and a date of review on it, because otherwise it could just be left to go on forever and people could just forget about going back to plan A. So there might be a 12-month duration, it might be 2 years, it depends on what the equipment is and what the software is and the level, the speed of replacement, or what the roadmap's looking like that we mentioned earlier on. But there must be a review date and an expiry date, even if it's going to be necessary in the future to extend the plan for another session, another cycle. It should be reviewed at a reasonably regular basis so that an assessment can be made as to whether it's still needed or not.
One of the other reasons for reviewing that is, if you're going to get incremental updates or point releases, or a full new version from your vendor for a piece of software, does the plan B still apply? Does the plan B need to be amended to meet the new challenges? Hopefully some of the previous accessibility challenges have been dissipated and gotten rid of in the point release or the full release. But there may be some new challenges for some people, some new inaccessibility barriers that are put into it, because sometimes you do get products that improve in one area but regress in another. So having that regular review, and the review might be every time there's a point release. It might just be 12 months. It might be when there's a whole new version released, because that's probably the time when things should particularly get better. But by keeping in touch with your vendor, working with that on them with that roadmap that we've talked about many times now is really important. So we've got a couple of examples, and these two examples are actually linked in the guide itself. So the University of Oregon has made a template available, which broadly reflects the structure that Neil just talked through, and Harvard University also has a suggested structure. They have an online form, so you might want to complete and submit that. Unless there's somebody about to move across to Harvard, but we thought that it was worth just talking through, as Neil said, everybody has some slight adaptations, but they're all sort of based around the same framework that we've talked about today.
So we, as Andrew says, chose these two examples because we really liked them, and we thought that they represented two good ways of doing the same job, and they're quite similar, but sufficiently slightly different as well. So we started off. The first one we point to is the University of Oregon, and if we just have a very quick look through the plan process that they have, and if you're wanting to have a plan B or an equally effective access plan, then their document has a number of sections. The first one is requester information. So who is actually making this request? It has a section on the product or service description. So that would include things like a description of the actual product in detail. We talked earlier about what it is, what the version number is, what the date of release was, that sort of thing. It talks about the users who will be using the product and how many people will be using that product, because that's going to impact on whether or not you are going to be well disposed to having such a plan. And linked to that, where will it be used and what for? So this goes back to the issue of is it going to be used in one place only by maybe half a dozen people, or is it actually going to be something which all staff are going to have to be using, like the leave request system that we mentioned earlier, or all students have to use, like for submitting assignments. So really important to nail down the issue of who's going to be using it, where, and what for. Then alternatives, what could be used instead? That keys into the issue of what are alternative applications or bits of equipment that could be used to enable someone to do the same job. Then the integration issue, will it be used with another product or another service? Really important question as well that they ask is this a renewal or is it a new purchase? Very important to be able to identify that, because that's telling you a little bit about the road of travel there. Then when it comes to the plan details, they have an issue description. So you're going to be able to describe what the plan will entail, who will be responsible for implementing it, and what resources will be required in terms of training or equipment or staff. And then what is the communications plan for ensuring that people know about this plan and know how to follow the process? And when will equipment be remediated, replaced, or retired? And then it gets down to the different levels of approvals. So who's going to be responsible for signing off on this plan and for making sure that it is actually kept to? And then we get down to the expiry date, the termination of the plan, and at what point will it be reviewed? Really, really useful. Not a big template, but detailed enough that you could build a plan out of that quite easily, and very much fitting in with the description that we gave earlier.
And Oregon do have that available to download if you just want to take something off the shelf and have a play with it now, for something that you might know is inaccessible and you probably should have a plan B in place for. The other example is Harvard University, and quite similar but structured slightly differently. First of all, the information about the inaccessible technology. What is it? Who's the vendor? Who's the contact? Who's the audience for it? And what are the barriers? So they're structuring their plan B slightly different from Oregon, but it is covering the same areas there. Then they talk about, get you to respond to who is likely to be affected by the accessibility issues, and how are they going to be affected? What is the role of the user? Is it student? Is it faculty? Is it administrative staff? Or it might even be members of the public, enrolling in public workshops or public events. And the second part of that, who is likely to be affected, how might those accessibility issues impact on the user? So who and how is what they're trying to tease out in that second part. Then they go on to ask, how will the responsible party provide, the responsible party being your institution, or a school or an administrative area within your institution, how will they provide an alternative means of completing that task, completing that process, undertaking the particular task that they've expected to do, either as as a student or as a staff member, or as they suggest, even as a member of the public. So what are the tasks and what are the issues there, and what resources might be required to provide that alternative means. So we're coming back to resources. It's and the amount of resources that you might be prepared to allocate are probably going to depend on the level of risk. Is it just that small group in one little lab somewhere, or is it all staff trying to apply for leave? Who's responsible for implementing the plan? Everybody needs to be documenting that. What's the job role and the contact information? And they suggest a job role because staff move around. So by suggesting that it's a job role rather than an individual, that's the person goes off on leave and somebody's backfilling, or they go off to a new role somewhere else. They're no longer the contact point. They don't want to be followed up about the plan B. The responsible party should also be familiar with and ready to execute that plan B. So they're making sure that you've got everything in place should somebody need it. How will the vendor or the technology provider correct the accessibility issues? And this is where we're talking about, do they have a roadmap? Who's going to communicate a new issue to the vendor? In what order will the vendor address those issues? Over what timeline will they take to address those issues? And so that you no longer need the plan B. So pretty much all the same information that Oregon required, just asking for it in a different order of presentation and different levels of detail in some of those places. So, all those headings that Neil talked through before are being picked up by these two universities who've got their templates and application for applying for the exemption for being fully accessible, what they're going to do about it. These two institutions, have got that well documented in terms of what they expect, somebody in their institution to do and to document before they say, okay, we now have a plan B in place.
So really important, I think, just to recognise that there are several takeouts from this, but one of them is that there is no get out of jail card. This is not a chance for people to say, oh, if I do a plan B, I don't have to worry about accessible procurement. They do have to worry about accessible procurement. That should be the default, but every scenario in life should have a fallback plan for when things don't quite go to plan. And this is what an equally effective alternate plan or a plan B is. It's not a get out of jail card. It's a what do I do if I can't do what I want to do card. And as we mentioned earlier, no access is no solution. I think that could be a slogan we could have, but it's certainly an important thing to take on board. But above all, if you're going to use this option, make sure that it's planned, there's a clear process that everyone understands, and that everyone also understands that they are consciously asking for an exception to an accessibility policy.
And picking up on Darren's comment in chat, I've heard so many times that no student has reported any issues. Have you, are they asked why they dropped out of a course? Was the plan B communicated that might have been in place or might not have been in place? So, it really reiterates that importance of making sure that anybody enrolling in that course or joining the staff at your institution are aware that if they do have an accessibility issue, you're aware of it, that particular bits of ICT equipment are going to be problematic for certain groups of people at different times, and that you have a plan to support them through that, so they don't just drop out or quit after 6 months because they can't do something. That's not the situation you want to be, because that word gets around, and those types of students will no longer enroll in those types of courses. They're voting with their feet, and you haven't helped them achieve the goals, the educational goals that they might have wanted to achieve. So over to you for any questions. Back to you, David.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew and Neil. And that, Darren, thanks for bringing up that often seen line about no one's formally complained. I think that's a really pervasive thought at times when it comes to proactive accessibility measures and why you should or shouldn't do them. So not receiving a complaint is not an indication that there isn't an issue. I think that whole David versus Goliath. My name's David. I'm allowed to use this sort of situation where you have to step forward and try and take on a massive institution to get something fixed. It's very, very hard to do for students to lodge a formal complaint in general speak. So as Andrew's well articulated, they more often than not simply won't say something. And no doubt you want to elaborate, Darren. I can see your hands raised.
Oh, there's 100 times that there's been Plan Bs, so thank you. And I think you touched on it. I think pretty succinctly that they're very unique and individualized to an institution and the support methods and things that are in place. But I did want to just ask about, because I often see that intersection of it put in, and we put together some guides for staff on using this bit of software, but we put no guides together for students using it, or even let the students know we've tried to purchase this. It's believed to be accessible according to these standards, etc. So the screen reader user knows that they can go and use this, because not every screen reader user, Neil, you'll testify to this as well, has the same capability to use some of these tools. And often they're new tools, and the guides we might go and make, or that are often made, are inaccessible guides. Somebody doing screen captures and shots. So just go here, click this, do this, and there we go. You can use the new tool. And we'll have some students come in that just completely struggle with the environment to start with, because there's no accessible guide to using what could well be an accessible tool.
Yeah.
And I see that quite often, and that's not our job again. So it's where does that fall, or should that be part of the Plan B? So to stop some of that Plan B is making sure that we've got accessible guides on the use of these tools. As you're saying, letting people know up front which bits work, which bits don't work, for that, so that students are well aware. I'm just focused, certainly, because my hat's with the student side, where that comes up, and that we may even put some, as you're saying, part of that Plan B in place for academics. Well, while you've got this widget, use it sparingly. Or it
Neil
might be
and I were
accessible,
talking about,
but it's not useful. Yeah.
Yes.
Neil and I came across a situation just earlier this week with a client where they've got a few pages where, if you're just a non-mouse user, you can tab through and activate the links and the buttons, and they work beautifully. But as soon as you ran JAWS, as well as using the keyboard for navigation, suddenly, unless you were a Power JAWS user, you couldn't activate those buttons because they didn't activate in the conventional way. And Neil, you can elaborate on, but you were saying, about how many people would know how to do that alternative.
Yeah, so in this instance, it was a page with buttons on that when you click the buttons, it would show you a different aspect of the page. So different sections of the page would be loaded depending on which button you'd pressed. And the conventional way of activating a button on web pages is to use the spacebar. This is a standard way of doing it. It's nothing to do with being a screen reader user. Anyone who uses a keyboard should be able to do that. And in this case, you could activate the button quite happily in the usual way by hitting the spacebar key. The moment you loaded a screen reader, and I tried it with a couple of screen readers, that functionality disappeared. Didn't have time for us to go and look at the code because that's not what we were actually there to do. But we did discover that by using mouse simulation keys with one particular screen reader, I was able to activate the buttons. But that is something which is a cognitive load on people who may not even know how to do that. And so that was a really good example. And I think to Darren's point, that if you have a product that is to all intents and purposes accessible, but then you don't bother to produce an accessible version of a user guide, however that user guide might be, then you haven't yet made it accessible. You've just gone a good deal of the way. And disabled people know that it's a very common experience that we have, that we get a piece of equipment that is wonderfully accessible, but the actual instructions are not. And that's a very, very real problem. And I think it's something which when something is considered as to whether it's accessible or not, part of that is the documentation accessible. And I think we did touch on that when we talked about the questions that you should ask vendors. That it isn't just the actual physical hardware or the software, it's the means by which you learn to use that software or hardware that is part of the mix. And one thing that you can certainly do and we always recommend it for people who are building websites and maintaining websites, is to have an accessibility page, which says, an accessibility page carries a statement about the accessibility of that particular site. And a good statement should be honest. It shouldn't be a chance to say, whoa, we really believe in accessibility and we love WCAG, and we absolutely strive to meet the WCAG 2.1 AA, but actually we don't. It actually needs to be upfront and honest and say, yeah, this is what our intention is, and we've achieved that intention if you have, or if you haven't, say that you haven't and say where you haven't. People actually get frustrated as much by being left in the dark about what the vendor thinks or what the operator thinks is accessible. If you know something is inaccessible, tell us, and we'll do something about finding workarounds. But so having a statement that draws attention to the accessibility features and indeed, if you like, the inaccessibility features, is a very positive thing to do.
That's fair feedback.
So, sorry, thank you, Neil. I'm sorry, it's Darren again. And then I'll stop hogging the question time. Just with that, the notion of a register and keeping track of that, because another thing that I commonly see is, even though we may have come up with a solution or a workaround, or there are, some unique ways, as you're saying, like with the power user to be able to do this, but then capturing that and putting it back into the system. So that we don't have that same discussion, or 10 people are having the same discussion in different ways with 10 different students, to all come up with their own version of something, and and start the process every single time that somebody registers an issue.
Yeah,
exactly. And that's why you need that feedback loop in your plan B, so that if you've got a student or a staff member who works with your plan B and says, yes, but you could have done it this way, have a means of capturing that and putting it back into that process and that documentation, as you say, Darren.
Yeah, and I remember, speaking with somebody when this is going together, it was Andrew, I think, and that notion, wouldn't it be nice to actually have a cost associated with that at the end, where you could say next time, if this upgrade had been fixed or this little bit had been put in, that would have actually saved us X amount, in the scheme of things. So, it's not just the cost of the software, it's the cost of then supporting the inaccessibility of that software, which largely goes unnoticed because it gets buried into other, roles as usual, business as usual, around the institution.
Back in the day, in a different life, I worked in an organization that ran a competition for the least accessible toilet. And we used to get nominations for accessible toilets that were placed in the most inaccessible environment, and you'd be amazed how many there were. And to me, if you provide an accessible piece of equipment but don't provide an accessible means of learning how to use it, it's the same as putting one of those accessible toilets at the top of a very large flight of stairs with no ramp and no lift.
Well, I think we're drawing to a close on the sessions, but this is really the last opportunity now to ask any questions about the accessible procurement process in general of Andrew and Neil while we've got them here. So if you are out there and you have a burning question, you're welcome to pop forward and put your mic on or type it into the chat and I'll read it out. And we'll give another minute for that to happen. And then if there is nothing, we'll conclude. Okay, we'll thank you very much, Andrew and Neil, for your 5-part series. It's a lot of effort to put it together and to come forward once a week and share your wisdom and knowledge. But I think on behalf of everybody that's attended the series and those who will watch it and use it on the Court website in the future, it's been very helpful. So thank you very much to both of you for the work you've put in. And thanks everyone for attending today.
Thank you.
Good to see people turning up each week. So that's been really rewarding.
Have a great day, everybody.